Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel is off the ground. After that, we're going to go ahead and remove the center cover. You're going to find a little tab in here that you can carefully get in between and gently pry without damaging the wheel. Go ahead and pull that off of there, give it a quick inspection, set that aside. After that, you're going to continue on by removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Let's remove the wheel. Now that the wheel's off of there, we have a nice clear view of our brakes. The area that we want to pay attention to first is the caliper. We're going to come right inside this area with a small pry bar and carefully try to push this piston in. Just going to come in between the caliper and the rotor itself, and we'll gently pry. Now once that's pushed in enough that you can move this around, we can continue on by removing our 2 10mm slider pins. Alright, so now that we have that pushed back, let's move along to our 2 10mm slider bolts. Leave that in there just a couple threads. We'll grab these bolts. It's a good idea to give them a quick inspection. You want to make sure the threaded area is still in good condition. These look fine, so I'll set them aside. Let's grab onto that caliper. We're going to carefully remove it from the knuckle area. Just grab onto it. You're going to lift up on the lower aspect and kind of pivot away. Now that we have that off there, let's go ahead and remove our pads. To remove the pads, we're going to continue on with our small pry bar. Looking at the outside of the caliper, you can find 2 little tabs that are attached to the pad itself. We're just going to carefully get in between that area and gently separate it a little bit. Once you have it a little separated, you should be able to slide that outer pad out of position. At this point, I always give them a quick inspection just to see how they're wearing. This one's pretty much worn out. We'll set that aside. Remove this one. Next, we can move along to pushing in the caliper piston. When you do this, you want to do it nice and slow, and you also want to make sure that you don't see any fluid coming around this protective boot. There's several tools you can use to do this. I'm going to go ahead and use a caliper compression tool. Now once again, you just want to double check and make sure you don't see any fluid. If you do, it's brake fluid and you'd have to replace the caliper. The next thing we're going to do is move along to the slider pins. To remove the slider pins, all I generally do is try to grab onto the boot. I'm going to try to peel it down and away from the slider itself. Once I have it peeled, I can try to push the slider pin through from the other side. And then of course we'll just remove it from the protective boot. Once you have it out of there, you want to give it a quick inspection, especially the areas where you can see there's a groove on either end. What you're looking for is to see if there's any rust or debris buildup. If there is, it could potentially make it so moisture might make its way inside the boot and freeze up your slider pin. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the areas that need to be cleaned, and then we'll lubricate everything. And then of course we'll do the exact same thing on the other side. Alright, I went ahead and cleaned up the slider pin. Now let's remove the boot from the caliper. To remove the boot, I'm just going to use a small screwdriver, carefully get in between the caliper and the boot itself. Once I'm in between, I'm just going to gently pry and try to separate the boot from the caliper. It's common for them to stick together a little bit. When you're doing this, you want to be very careful not to rip or damage the boot in any way. To get this out of here, generally all you want to do is carefully press in on one area, just like this, and then you're going to grab it, squeeze it, and then bring it out through the other side. I'm going to do it with my fingers. It's going to be a little hard to see. Now you want to give the boot a quick inspection. This area right along here is where it goes through the caliper, and if there's any type of rust or rot on the caliper in this area, it's generally going to be built up, and that's going to cause a restriction for the slider. So with that said, you want to make sure you clean off any debris from the outer aspect. You also want to make sure that you clean up any debris from inside the caliper where the boot's supposed to go. We'll lubricate that as well. And then after all that, go ahead and run a rag through the center of this. Don't use any solvent because the solvent will break down the rubber. Once this is nice and clean, we can go ahead and put it back together. We'll just give that a quick inspection. Time to continue on with a little bit of high temperature caliper lubricant. Let's go ahead and put that right inside the port. Just a thin amount will do. Essentially, we just want to keep moisture away from the area so we don't get any more rust or rot buildup. To reinstall the boot, go ahead and grab onto it. We're going to squeeze down the center just like we did to remove it. Now, once you have it squeezed, go ahead and slide it right on through there. Go ahead and expand that boot. Give it a little spin just to work in the grease. I'm just going to move it around a little bit. Wipe down any excess grease you might have in the area. Time for the slider pin. Continue on with that high temperature grease. We're going to go ahead and coat the entire shaft of the slider pin. The areas that you mainly want to focus on is those grooves that I told you to make sure you clean out. This is going to help keep moisture and debris out of the slider pin area. It's very important. Let's get that slider pin in here. Let's come in from an angle. Slide it right on in. Now before I push it in all the way, I'm just going to use a little bit of that high temperature grease and I'm going to come right inside the boot. I want to try to get all the way up into this area where it meets up against the caliper itself, just for a little added lubrication. I'm just going to recoat this. Now once you feel as though you have it in there, you just want to move it back and forth a little bit. You want to make sure the boot is sitting inside the grooves on both sides of the slider pin. Once it's in there, just go ahead and wipe down any excess grease and then do the exact same thing to the other slider pin. Continue on with that high temperature caliper grease and we're going to go right along the metallic aspect of the piston. Once you have that coated, continue on to each of these two ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now it's time to remove the rotor. Carefully grab onto it, give it a little wiggle, and pull it off of here. I like to give them a quick inspection. Set it aside. Now the next thing we're going to do is continue on by cleaning up the areas where the rotor is going to need to sit. Let's go ahead and sand that down so it's a smooth surface. Let's continue on by applying some copper never sees to our hub mating surface. Double check to make sure you didn't get any on your emergency brake shoes. Now it's time to install our rotor. Just carefully slide it right on over those emergency brake shoes. If it feels like it's binding, trying to go on, you need to go ahead and take it right back off. You're going to double check the emergency brake shoes to make sure they're sitting properly and the emergency brake is not in the on position. Now it's going to be time to put on your brake pads. You'll notice in the kit you have two that have these ears and then two that have this point right here. So of course you're going to want to grab one of each. Also, if you were to look at the pad, you're going to find that you have a cutout notch like this, and then you're going to have a totally different notch. So you just want to go ahead and pay attention to that. When we put the pads in, what we're going to do is you want to make sure that it can slide in with the notch up along the top, and then it rolls in just like that along the bottom. You want to make sure it does that for both of the pads. Once you're sure you have the proper pads, let's go ahead and get them into the caliper. Let's go ahead and take that inboard pad. We're going to slide this right into the caliper. Press it down, listen for a click. Time for the outboard pad. Let's slide that right over the caliper. Slide it in, listen for a click as well. Double check both of the pads to make sure they're completely secured to the caliper itself. Now we can go ahead and take the caliper and we're going to slide it over the knuckle and over the rotor. When you do that, you want to pay attention to the sliders. It's a good idea to go ahead and push those so they're in the fully outward position towards the inner aspect of the vehicle. Let's take that caliper and we'll slide it right on over. You want to pay attention to the top of each of the pads. We want to make sure that the bracket slides in. If it feels like the caliper doesn't want to go on, more than likely it's due to your slider pin. You just want to carefully push that towards the inboard aspect of the vehicle. After that, let's take our 2 caliper slider bolts. We'll get those into position. Now you want to start them both in. Bottom them out. Now we can torque each of them to 24 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here. Start on all of your lug nuts, bottom them out. We'll get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, let's torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Of course, if you had a center cover, go ahead and put it on now. Looking at the back, you can see the areas where all the lug nuts need to fit into. Make sure it's secure. Okay friends, we got one side of the truck's pads and rotors done. Now of course you're going to want to make sure that you do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, make sure you pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.